every day. The anxiety that had settled inside for a long time was only growing. No matter how hard she tried to distract herself with her studies, work, and meetings with friends, thoughts of Lucas would not let her go. But it wasn't just her thoughts that tormented her. Every memory of him caused a whole storm of emotions that she could no longer cope with. Aya knew that her affection for Lucas had long gone beyond brotherly love. These were no longer simple memories of childhood games or school days spent together. She felt something much deeper for him, something that tore her apart. Aya understood that this was wrong, that her feelings for her own brother violated all the norms and moral principles that had been instilled in her since childhood. But they didn't disappear, no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that it was just temporary insanity. The months since she realized her feelings had been a living hell. Aya felt her life begin to lose its meaning. She couldn't concentrate on her studies or her work. Her academic performance at the university declined sharply, and this did not go unnoticed by the teachers. She started avoiding friends, stopped attending social events, although she used to be very active. Everything that used to bring joy has become meaningless. All her thoughts, all her strength, were focused on somehow coping with what was happening inside her. But the scariest thing for Aya was that her feelings for Lucas were getting stronger, not weaker. She felt that every day her heart was drawn more and more to him, and this craving, this inner fire became unbearable. Every time she saw him, she felt the ground give out from under her feet. His every touch, every smile, every word caused such a storm of emotions in her that she could barely restrain herself from giving herself away. Aya was afraid that if this continued, she would simply not be able to stand it. She and Lucas had always been close, and he was not only her brother, but also her best friend. She could tell him everything, share her innermost thoughts, and he always understood her. But now this intimacy was becoming unbearable. She couldn't be around him anymore, couldn't maintain the same relationship as before. Aya knew that the only way out was to cut off all contact with Lucas, to leave his life, no matter how painful it was for her. It was the only thing she could do to keep at least some part of herself. The decision was painful. Aya couldn't imagine her life without Lucas, but at the same time she understood that if nothing was changed, it would lead to even more destruction. Her feelings for him were becoming too dangerous, too intense, and she could no longer control them. Aya was sure that if she continued to communicate with Lucas, her life would turn into endless torture. She couldn't look him in the eye anymore, couldn't communicate with him the way she used to, without her heart pounding wildly. Aya thought for a long time about how to tell Lucas that she needed to leave. She couldn't just disappear without an explanation, but at the same time it was hard for her to find words. How could she explain to him what was going on in her heart when she didn't fully understand it herself? How could she tell him that her love for him had gone beyond brotherly affection without destroying everything? She didn't want him to know how she felt. It would be too painful for both him and her. But it was also impossible to leave in silence. Finally, Aya made a decision. She packed up the things she planned to take with her and arranged for temporary accommodation in another city. She decided to go as far away as possible to put a distance between them that could help her cope with her feelings. It wasn't easy, but she knew there was no other way out. The day before she left, Aya was sitting in a cafe waiting for Lucas. This was their usual meeting place, and she knew that this would be the last time they would see each other. Her hands were shaking and her heart was beating so hard that she could barely breathe. She had thought out in advance what she would say to him, but the closer the moment of the meeting became, the more doubts appeared in her mind. Maybe this is a mistake? Maybe it's worth trying to cope with feelings and not break off the relationship. But these thoughts were immediately replaced by horror at what could happen if she stayed. When Lucas entered the cafe, Aya felt her heart stop. He looked like he always did, confident, smiling, with that same warmth in his eyes that always made her feel safe. But now that warmth was only tearing her apart.
Hi. You're so thoughtful today. Is everything okay?
His voice was so familiar, that Aya wanted to immediately put all her plans out of her head, forget about the decision and just be with him. But she knew she couldn't do it.
Lucas, we need to talk.
These words came to her with great difficulty. She stared at him, trying not to show her excitement, but she felt tears begin to come to her eyes. She was on edge. She wanted to throw her arms around his neck and tell him how much she loved him, but that would be a disaster. Lucas frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. He felt that something was wrong, and this only increased her torment.
What happened? You've been acting weird lately. I'm worried about you.
These words pierced Aya. He was always there for her, always supporting her, and the thought of her leaving him, disappearing from his life forever, was unbearable. But at the same time, she knew that this was the only way to deal with what was happening. Aya sighed, trying to gather all her strength. She couldn't afford to burst into tears right here in this cafe. She had to be strong, if only to end this conversation.
I'm leaving. To another city. I need time for myself. I need to figure out my life. I can't go on as it was.
Lucas looked at her in amazement. He clearly hadn't expected such words. Aya saw his face change, replaced by concern and complete incomprehension.
Are you leaving? But why? We've always dealt with everything together. What has changed?
These questions hurt Aya. He didn't understand what was going on, and she couldn't blame him for that. Her heart was bursting with pain, but she knew she couldn't tell him the truth. It would be too destructive for both of them. She has to leave without explanation. Just disappear, no matter how painful it is.
Lucas, I just can't. I need to sort myself out. That's all I can say.
She tried to speak firmly, but her voice trembled treacherously. A storm of emotions was raging inside her, but she couldn't afford to lose her temper. Aya saw Lucas trying to figure out what was going on, but he clearly couldn't believe that his sister would just leave without an explanation.
But you're coming back, aren't you?
His voice sounded like he was still hoping that this was just a temporary solution. But Aya knew that if she left, she wouldn't come back. She needed to break this bond forever in order to keep at least some part of herself. Her feelings for Lucas were destroying her, and if she didn't leave, they would destroy her completely.
I do not know, Lucas. Just please accept it. I need time.
She couldn't say more. There was a lump in her throat, and she was afraid that if she said another word, she would just burst into tears right there in front of him. This was the last conversation, and she couldn't afford to be weak. Aya stood up, avoiding his gaze, and without saying another word, left the cafe. Outside, she stopped, feeling the world crumble around her. She had just broken the bond that was the most important thing in her life. Her heart was broken, but she knew it was the only way. She needed to leave to save herself. It's been a few weeks since Aya left. For Lucas, this time was a real nightmare. He couldn't understand what had happened and why his younger sister had suddenly made such a strange decision. Aya was his best friend, the person with whom he could share everything in the world. Their bond had always seemed unbreakable, and now that it was suddenly broken, Lucas couldn't find a place for himself. He tried to contact Aya, but her phone was turned off and messages went unanswered. This silence was tearing him apart. Lucas has always been a man of action. He was used to solving problems and never gave up before difficulties. But this situation was different. Aya simply disappeared from his life without giving any explanation. He felt powerless, because no amount of his efforts could bring her back. All their joint plans, habits, rituals suddenly lost their meaning. He was used to spending time with his sister, and her absence created a void in his life that nothing could fill. Every morning, Lucas woke up thinking that Aya was no longer around. He tried to get back to his usual life work, friends, parties, it all happened, but everything seemed colorless and unreal. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about what would make her leave. It seemed to him that he had missed something, that he had been inattentive to what was happening inside her. They have always been close, sharing their innermost thoughts and experiences with each other. But now Lucas realized that he didn't know something important that Aya was hiding from him. He couldn't just sit and wait. Every new attempt to contact her ended in failure. Lucas began to wonder if he had done something that had pushed her to take such a step. Had he offended her in some way? But what could it be? He replayed the last months of their communication in his head, trying to find a clue. Everything seemed the same as always. He couldn't figure out what the reason was. Lucas started looking for her through friends and acquaintances, but no one knew where she was now. Aya has always been independent, and even her closest friends did not know where she decided to settle. This silence irritated Lucas on all sides. He felt that his life had turned upside down, and now he had lost the core that had always been a pillar of support. It took a few more days before Lucas decided that he couldn't just sit back anymore. He knew that he had to find Aya, no matter how difficult the path was. He felt that there were too many unexplained things between them. It wasn't just an impulse caused by disappointment. Lucas sensed that there was something much deeper in their relationship that they were both afraid to admit. And now that Aya is gone, that understanding has only become sharper. His search began with the simplest steps. Lucas began writing to her university professors, claiming that he was worried that he couldn't find her. But even here, he was disappointed Aya suspended her studies without telling anyone where she was. Her name disappeared from all the lists, as if she had erased her existence from the usual circle of people. This fact only increased Lucas' anxiety. She didn't just leave, but decided to disappear completely. What could have made her do that? What thoughts and emotions made her take such a step? The more Lucas thought about it, the more convinced he became that Aya was hiding something she couldn't tell him. He started going through all the possible places where she could be. Aya loved to travel, and Lucas remembered how she dreamed of some cities. She always said that she would like to visit Chicago, a city that seemed to her not as cold and oppressive as megacities like New York or Los Angeles. Perhaps she decided to start a new life there. It was just a guess, but Lucas had no choice but to follow his intuition. Lucas quit his job for a week, took a short vacation and bought a ticket to Chicago. He didn't know if he would find her there, but he couldn't just stay at home anymore. The feeling of emptiness and uncertainty was destroying him from the inside. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was losing control of the situation. Every new day without Aya made his life grey and barren. When he arrived in Chicago, the city seemed strange and gloomy to him. The cold autumn wind pierced through to the bones, and the grey skyscrapers intensified the feeling of loneliness. Lucas strolled through the streets, trying to imagine where Aya could live. He started going into cafes where they could have crossed paths if she had really been here, but the search was not successful. Chicago was too big a city to just happen to meet someone. But Lucas didn't give up. He began checking local libraries, universities, even student dormitories. He showed her a photo, hoping that someone would recognize her and tell him where she was. Several days of unsuccessful searches passed, but Lucas did not despair. He felt he had to be persistent. One evening, when he was beginning to lose hope, Lucas went into a small cozy cafe on the outskirts of the city. This place reminded him of their favorite cafe at home, where they often spent time talking about everything in the world. He didn't expect anything special. He just decided to have a cup of coffee, when suddenly his gaze fell on a familiar silhouette in the far corner of the hall. It was her Aya.
Aya?
Her name came out of his mouth before he had time to think. Aya raised her head and their eyes met. Time seemed to slow down at that moment. She looked different, more tired than before, but it was still her, the sister he had been looking for all these weeks. Her face reflected a mixture of shock and concern. She hadn't expected to see him here.
Lucas.
Her voice was low, almost a whisper. She didn't move, just sat at her desk, as if she was afraid that any movement would destroy the fragile reality of this moment. Lucas took a step towards her, but stopped when he saw that she was not ready to talk.
I've been looking for you. Why did you leave? Why didn't you say anything?
Aya looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She knew this moment was inevitable, but she still wasn't ready for it. Feelings she couldn't control were fighting inside her. She had run away, hoping to find a way to deal with her emotions, but now Lucas was here, and her inner world began to crumble again.
I needed time. I couldn't go on like I used to.
Those words were empty and meaningless to Lucas. He couldn't figure out what was behind this time she needed. In his eyes, it seemed like an excuse. He knew his sister too well to believe in such simple explanations.
Time. From what? We've always been there for you, Aya. Why do you think you can just leave it all like that?
His voice was filled with anger and pain. He couldn't understand why she had made such a decision without him, why she hadn't trusted him with her feelings. There had always been a place for trust in their relationship, and now that trust seemed to have been destroyed. Aya didn't know how to explain to him what she couldn't quite understand herself.
I can't explain it, Lucas. Simply, please understand. I had to leave. It was for my own good.
She could feel the tears starting to come to her eyes, but she couldn't afford to cry. She'd been trying to keep her emotions under control all this time. But now that Lucas was standing in front of her, everything she'd tried to forget was coming back to the surface. Her inner world was in chaos, and she knew she couldn't explain to him everything that was going on inside her. Lucas sighed at her words. He didn't understand what exactly was bothering her, but he could see that she was suffering. It couldn't be an easy decision for her, nor was it easy for him. But he was determined not to let it end like this. He couldn't let her disappear from his life.
I'm not giving up, Aya. You can hide as much as you want, but I won't let you just walk away. We have to figure this out together, as always.
Aya looked at him, feeling her heart constrict with pain and love at the same time. She understood that Lucas would never leave it just like that, but she knew that she would not be able to return to what was before. Her feelings for him were too strong, too dangerous. But his words awakened hope in her that maybe they could figure it out after all, if not now, then someday. Aya nodded, not knowing what to say. This moment was too hard for her, but she couldn't run away anymore. Lucas wasn't going to give up, and that meant she would have to find a way to deal with what was going on in her heart. After meeting Lucas in Chicago, Aya felt that her life was out of control again. That encounter was like a reminder of what she was trying to escape from, but it finally convinced her that she couldn't just ignore her feelings. Her departure, her decision to disappear, her desire to start a new life, all this turned out to be useless, because just the presence of Lucas reawakened emotions inside her that she tried to suppress. But Aya knew she couldn't afford to fall into the same emotions again. Back in her new life, Aya did her best to regain control of her existence. She got a job, which she found shortly after moving to Chicago. Work became her salvation. It allowed her to keep her thoughts under control and occupy every minute with something useful. Her office was in the center of the city, surrounded by skyscrapers and bustle, and this business environment helped her to take her mind off everything personal. She tried to avoid any intimacy with her colleagues, kept her distance and focused solely on her duties. Every day, Aya came to the office early in the morning and left late at night. Work became her refuge, a place where she could not think about her feelings for Lucas, about her torment and inner struggle. But as soon as she returned home, her thoughts returned to her brother. She replayed that meeting in her head, his eyes full of concern, his attempts to understand her. Aya understood that his indifference only increased her own pain, because she knew that they would never be able to be together in the way her heart desired. Despite her attempts to distract herself, loneliness and internal conflict weighed on her with renewed vigor. Aya began to realize that her escape had not solved the problem, it had only postponed it. She left her life behind, but her feelings did not disappear. She was sure that she would never be able to truly forget Lucas, but she could not continue to live in this state either. At some point it became clear to her that she needed to try something new, maybe even build a relationship with someone else. Aya pushed this thought away for a long time, because she believed that no new relationship could overshadow her feelings for Lucas. But eventually she realized that if she didn't try to start life over with someone else, she risked being trapped in her emotions forever. Her feelings for Lucas seemed an inevitable part of her being, but she knew that if she continued to live with it inside, she would completely lose herself. The appearance of a new person in her life was unexpected. There was a man named Michael in the office where she worked, who had noticed her from the first days of her work. He was several years older than her, confident, with a slight smile and kind eyes. Michael was one of those people who could always find the right words to cheer up, always came to the rescue on time, and was a reliable support for everyone in the team. His charm and charisma could not go unnoticed, and Aya, although she tried to keep him at a distance, soon felt that she liked him. Michael took his time courting. He watched Aya from afar, seeing in her something more than just a new colleague. She was withdrawn and secretive, but there was something about her that attracted him: inner strength, independence, and at the same time a visible vulnerability that she carefully hid. Michael understood that Aya was going through something deep, and it intrigued him. Unlike other women, who easily agreed to compliments and flirting, Aya always remained cold and distant. But her mystique only fueled his interest. Aya resisted his attention for a long time. She knew that any infatuation with Michael would only be superficial, because her heart still belonged to Lucas. But Michael was persistent, and at some point she realized that this could be her chance to try to live a different life. He didn't look like Lucas, and that seemed right to her. She hoped that if she was with him, she would be able to forget about her previous feelings, at least for a while. Their first meetings were cautious. Aya didn't want to show that she was interested in Michael, but she couldn't completely ignore his attention either. He invited her to lunch, arranged small surprises in the office, and tried to maintain a light and relaxed atmosphere. It was a strange experience for Aya. She was not used to such care and attention from a man who was not Lucas. Michael was kind and considerate, but Aya found herself comparing him to her brother all the time. She tried to suppress these comparisons, convincing herself that it was part of her healing process. She needed to stop thinking about Lucas, and Michael seemed like an opportunity to do that. However, inside she couldn't get rid of the feeling that these weren't real feelings. Every time Michael touched her hand or complimented her, her heart didn't respond the way it did when Lucas did. She felt like she was on stage, playing a role, but not feeling a real inner response. Despite this, Aya continued to date Michael. She felt she had to give herself a chance at something new, even if it didn't seem right to her. Their relationship began to develop. Michael turned out to be patient and did not put pressure on her. Although he was well aware that Aya was hiding something, he saw that her emotions were restrained, that she was not ready for serious steps, and respected her boundaries. At one point he even tried to find out from her what exactly was bothering her, but Aya skillfully avoided such conversations. Michael was a good man, and Aya knew it. He was caring, attentive, and seemed to sincerely want them to succeed. But every day she felt more and more acutely that her feelings for him were superficial. Every time they spent time together, she tried to convince herself that it was just a matter of time, that real affection would come later, but her heart still belonged to Lucas. The more she tried to establish herself in the idea that Michael could be her future, the stronger her inner tension became. Each new meeting with him turned into a kind of test. She felt that Michael deserved something more than the little emotion she could give him, but she couldn't bring herself to be truly sincere with him. Every day she felt more and more that she was deceiving not only Michael, but also herself. She kept hoping that one day she would be able to feel for him the same way she felt for Lucas, but those hopes were in vain. The fire of that forbidden love that she had tried so hard to stifle was still burning inside her. A few months later, Aya realized that her attempt to build a new relationship had failed. She could no longer continue this deception. She could not afford to be with a man for whom she had no true affection. It wasn't fair to Michael, who was trying to make her happy, but no matter what he did, her heart remained closed. One evening, when they were having dinner together, Aya looked at Michael and realized that she could no longer continue this relationship. She saw the expectation in his eyes, the hope that she would finally open up to him, but she couldn't do it. She couldn't give him what he wanted. At that moment, Aya realized that she needed to finish this not only for his sake, but also for her own. She needed to get rid of the illusions that a new relationship would help her forget Lucas. Aya decided to end her relationship with Michael. It was a difficult decision, because she knew she would hurt him. He didn't deserve to end up like this. He was a good man, and she knew he deserved someone who could truly love him. But she couldn't deceive him or herself anymore. When Aya told him about her decision, Michael accepted. It's with amazing calmness. He had long felt that she was not really with him. Although he was in pain, he did not reproach her. He realized that Aya was struggling with something inside herself, and that her feelings for him had never been strong enough to build a future. Michael was disappointed, but at the same time admitted that their relationship was doomed from the very beginning. The breakup with Michael left Aya alone with herself. She was back at the same point where she had started, all the same painful thoughts about Lucas, all the same feelings that she could not overcome. But now she realized that no new relationship would help her forget about what was going on inside her. Michael was just an attempt to get away from his feelings, and that attempt failed. Aya realized that she would have to deal with her love for Lucas somehow, because there was no point running away from her anymore. She could try again and again, but each time she ended up with the same thing. Her heart remained devoted to someone it could not truly love. A year has passed since Aya decided to sever all ties with Lucas and start her life with a clean slate. This year was full of inner feelings, suffering, and attempts to forget the past, which, as it turned out, were in vain. Time seemed to move slowly, and attempts to build a new life did not bring the results she had hoped for. Aya moved to another city, started a new relationship with Michael, but all this only temporarily distracted her from the fact that the breakup with Lucas left a void in her soul that no one else could fill. This year has been full of events that Aya might not want to remember. She immersed herself in her work, trying as little as possible to think about what she had left behind. Her thoughts about Lucas gradually faded into the background, but they never completely disappeared. Every morning, every evening, every moment of silence was filled with the ghostly image of the brother she loved, but could not afford to love. She always knew that at some point she would have to face reality again, but she hoped that it would happen as late as possible. Her new life in Chicago was full of routine, which helped her cope with constant pain. Aya got a job at a law firm, where she got the opportunity to move up the career ladder. Her skills and desire for success were quickly noticed, and this became another salvation for her from thoughts of the past. The working days were busy, demanding full concentration, and this allowed her to at least temporarily not think about Lucas. But as evening fell, when she was alone in her small apartment, her inner demons returned. Aya often wondered what was going on in Lucas's life. She tried to imagine how he was living without her, whether he had continued his life, whether he had found someone who could replace her place in his heart. She tried not to check his social media, not to contact mutual friends, so as not to find out how he was doing. Any information about him could only increase her suffering, because she knew that if she returned her thoughts to the past, she would have to fight again with feelings that had not disappeared anywhere. Every time she came across the memories of Lucas, her heart was filled with conflicting emotions. On the one hand, she was proud that she was able to leave, that she had made the right choice, allowing both herself and him to move on. On the other hand, she still yearned for the closeness they shared. The pain of losing this relationship was too deep to just disappear. Even after a year, Aya felt that her soul continued to live in the past, although her body was in the present. On top of everything else, her attempt to start a relationship with Michael turned out to be unsuccessful. At first, Aya believed that she could love him, but every day with him only intensified her inner struggle. Michael was a good man, attentive and caring, but her heart never beat the way it did when Lucas was around. After several months of unsuccessfully trying to be happy with another man, Aya broke off this relationship. She couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore when a hurricane of contradictions was raging inside her. Her life in Chicago became a vicious circle. Work, home, rare meetings with friends, all this did not bring real relief. Aya felt that despite all her attempts to get away from the past, she was still clinging to it. But despite this, she continued to persistently move forward, hoping that time would heal her wounds sooner or later. However, everything changed when an invitation to a family event arrived. It was an annual meeting of a large family on the occasion of their parents' wedding anniversary. Every year the whole family gathered together to celebrate this event, and it would be unacceptable to miss it. Aya understood that she could not refuse, although she knew that Lucas would be at this celebration. She spent the whole way home to her hometown in anxious thoughts. Her heart was torn between the desire to see her brother and the fear that this meeting would revive those feelings that she had been trying to suppress for so long. She knew that she would not be able to hide her emotions if they met face to face, but to refuse the invitation would be too suspicious. The family didn't know what she was hiding, and if she hadn't come, it would have raised a lot of questions that she didn't have answers to. When Aya finally arrived home, she felt as if she had returned to the past again. Everything reminded her of the days when she and Lucas were inseparable. In childhood and adolescence, they always spent a lot of time together in this house, and every corner was saturated with memories of it. Her heart sank when she realized that in the next few hours she would have to meet her brother again. The family party was held in a large country house, where Aya spent many happy moments as a child. When she entered the house, everything looked the same as before. Parents, relatives, family, friends, everyone was here. The noise of conversation, laughter, the sounds of celebration, all this should have distracted her, but she knew that Lucas was somewhere among this crowd. Aya tried to avoid his gaze, but she felt his presence. She felt that every step she took was aimed only at not being near him. However, with each passing hour, the tension inside her grew. Her heart beat faster when she felt Lucas was there, even if they weren't talking to each other. She saw him out of the corner of her eye, the same confident and calm he always was. His smile, his laugh, all this awakened old feelings in her, and Aya realized that she had hoped in vain that she would be able to avoid these emotions. At some point, when everyone was busy talking and dancing, Aya felt that she could no longer be in this house. Her breathing quickened, and she went outside to get some fresh air. It was quiet and peaceful outside. The light of the lanterns softly illuminated the courtyard. She leaned on the railing of the terrace, trying to calm her heartbeat. But just as she started to regain control, the door behind her opened and Aya heard footsteps. She knew who it was without even turning around. Lucas walked over to her. He, too, felt the tension that had been hanging in the air since her arrival. This year has been no less difficult for him. Despite all his attempts to forget about what had happened, he couldn't get rid of the thought of his sister. The meeting in Chicago only increased his anxiety, but he couldn't bring himself to try to find her again. He respected her desire to leave, but that didn't mean his feelings were gone. Like Aya, Lucas lived in the shadow of this forbidden love that neither of them could afford. They were standing side by side on the terrace, and at that moment, time seemed to stop. Everything that happened inside the house ceased to matter. They stood in silence, each with their own thoughts and feelings. It was a strange mixture of pain and relief to finally be close to each other again, but to realize that their feelings had not changed, but only become stronger. Aya felt her heart constrict with tension. She wanted to leave, to run away again, but she knew that it would not solve her problems. She couldn't run away from her emotions anymore. Meeting Lucas made her admit that neither time nor distance helped her cope with what she was feeling. This year, spent trying to forget him, turned out to be a waste of time. They were both silent. They didn't need words to understand each other. Aya knew that Lucas felt as conflicted about her presence as he felt about hers. She felt that every moment with him only intensified her inner struggle, but she couldn't leave. Despite all the pain and confusion of their relationship, Aya could no longer deny that Lucas was still the most important person in her life. Lucas didn't know what to say either. During this year he tried to live his life, but nothing could replace his sister. He was sure that he would have done the same as her if he had been in her place. But that didn't make their meeting any less painful. He understood that their bond was too strong to just forget about it. And at that moment, standing on the terrace in silence, they both realized that no amount of time or distance could destroy what bound them. This meeting was a moment of truth for Aya. She realized that all her attempts to escape from her feelings had been in vain. Her love for Lucas did not disappear, but only intensified over time. This year away from him had shown her that she couldn't truly be free as long as she continued to struggle with what she was feeling. And although she did not know what would happen next, one thing became obvious to her. She could no longer live pretending that her feelings did not exist. After that fateful meeting with Lucas at a family holiday, Aya returned to Chicago in even more confusion than before. Her attempts to escape from her feelings completely failed. Despite the year she spent away from her brother, her love for him did not weaken, but on the contrary, became even stronger. The internal struggle that had plagued her from the very beginning continued to tear her apart, and the more she tried to hide it from herself and others, the more her suffering became. After returning to the city, Aya plunged back into work, trying to fill her time and thoughts with anything rather than thinking about Lucas. But even in the midst of her work, her mind kept returning to the moment when they were standing next to each other on the terrace. His gaze, his closeness, all this awakened feelings in her that she tried to stifle, and now it seemed to her that she would never be able to get rid of this pain. Shortly after that meeting with Lucas, her new partner, Michael, began to notice changes in Aya's behavior. Although their relationship was already going through difficult times, after returning from her hometown, she became even more distant, withdrawn and emotionally unavailable. Michael was patient and attentive, but even he couldn't help but notice that something had gone wrong. With each passing week, Aya became more and more immersed in her inner feelings, and their relationship began to crumble before her eyes. Michael was the one who gave Aya a chance to start a new life. He was kind and sincere, tried to be a support for her, despite the fact that she often withdrew into herself. He didn't know what exactly she was fighting, but he sensed that Aya was hiding something important. He saw how her mood was changing, how she was becoming more and more withdrawn, and this caused him more and more questions. Michael tried not to push her, hoping that she would come to him with an explanation, but every day his patience ran out. For Aya, Michael became a kind of salvation, an opportunity to get away from those forbidden feelings that were tearing her apart. She hoped that she could love him, that a relationship with him would help her forget about Lucas, but all her efforts were in vain. Michael was a good man, but her heart remained closed to him. She knew she couldn't give him what he wanted, but she kept hoping that things would change over time. However, after that meeting with Lucas, Aya realized that her feelings for her brother had not disappeared anywhere. Moreover, they have become even stronger. Every time she tried to be with Michael, her heart went back to Lucas over and over again. She tried to fight with herself, to convince herself that Michael was her future, that she could build a normal life with him. But it seemed increasingly impossible to her. Her love for Lucas did not allow her to move on. Michael, although he did not know all the details, began to notice that something was wrong. He noticed how Aya became even more withdrawn and detached after returning from a trip. Their conversations became shallow, and even the moments when they spent time together seemed empty and insignificant to her. Her thoughts were always somewhere else, and Michael could feel it. He tried to have frank conversations with her, but each time she avoided answers, walked away from the topic, not wanting to immerse herself in her inner feelings. Over time, the tension between them began to grow. Aya felt that she could no longer pretend that her relationship with Michael had a future. She didn't want to hurt him, but her feelings for Lucas had become so strong that she couldn't ignore them anymore. At the same time, Michael increasingly noticed her detachment and coldness, and this could not but affect their relationship. One day, when they were together in her apartment, Michael decided to have a frank conversation. He could no longer tolerate the uncertainty and the constant feeling that Aya was hiding something important. There was pain and disappointment in his voice when he asked what was happening to her and why she was constantly moving away. Aya, feeling that she could no longer continue this deception, was unable to give him specific answers. She tried to explain that her inner world was too complicated, that she was confused about her feelings, but she couldn't reveal the truth that her heart belonged to Lucas. This conversation was a turning point in their relationship. Michael, despite his feelings for Aya, realized that she would not be able to give him what he was waiting for. He was sensitive enough to see that she was going through something much deeper than just temporary difficulties. He knew that Aya was not ready to open up to him completely, and this understanding was the last straw for him. After this conversation, their relationship began to rapidly collapse. Aya could no longer maintain the appearance that everything was fine. Her heart was consumed with thoughts of Lucas, and every day with Michael became a torment for her. She felt guilty about him, because she knew he deserved to be with someone who could truly love him. But she couldn't offer him that because her feelings for Lucas were too strong. Michael, too, could no longer live in a state of uncertainty. He saw that their relationship had reached an impasse, and although he still loved Aya, he understood that these feelings were one-sided. He tried to fight for their future, but gradually began to realize that continuing this relationship would only increase his own pain. Aya couldn't offer him what he needed to create a strong alliance, and he understood that. For several weeks, their relationship dragged on in agonizing uncertainty. They continued to meet, spend time together, but every moment was filled with tension and hidden emotions. There was a storm of contradictions inside Aya. She wanted to move forward, but she couldn't let go of her feelings for Lucas. Michael became more and more distant, realizing that his efforts to maintain this relationship were in vain. Finally, the moment came when everything became obvious. Aya realized that she could not continue this relationship, and she had to make a difficult decision. She knew she had to break them off so she wouldn't hurt Michael anymore. It was a difficult decision because she didn't want to hurt him, but at the same time she understood that continuing this relationship would only be a torment for both of them. Aya invited Michael to dinner to discuss everything that had accumulated over the past months. She thought for a long time about how to tell him the truth, but eventually realized that she had to be honest. Michael was an important person in her life, and she didn't want to lie to him anymore. She couldn't tell him that her heart belonged to someone else, but she was able to admit that she couldn't offer him what he deserved. That evening was filled with silence and tension. Aya tried her best to be sincere, but her voice trembled with excitement and guilt. She knew that she was disappointing Michael, that she was breaking his heart, but it was the only right decision. Michael, in turn, listened to her, trying to contain his emotions. He had long ago realized that their relationship had come to an end, but hearing this from Aya was the last blow for him. They didn't see each other again after that dinner. Michael left her life as quietly as he appeared. Their relationship ended, leaving Aya feeling relieved and guilty at the same time. She knew that she had done the right thing by breaking off this relationship, but her heart was heavy with the realization that she was alone again. And even though Michael was a good man, her thoughts and feelings still returned to Lucas. Left alone, Aya realized that she could no longer continue to live, ignoring her feelings. Her love for Lucas has not disappeared, despite all her attempts to start a new life. Now that her relationship with Michael was over, it became clear to her that the future she was trying to build away from her brother was just an illusion. Her heart couldn't betray how she felt about Lucas, and she needed to find a way to deal with it. After breaking up with Michael and completing her failed attempts to start a new life, Aya found herself at a crossroads. Everything she had tried to build this year away from Lucas had collapsed. She tried to escape from her feelings, hide from reality, immerse herself in work, new relationships, and even a new life, but each time her heart returned to her brother. Now that her life was in chaos again, she was faced with the same question she had been running from: what to do with this forbidden love that was not giving her any peace. Aya thought for a long time about what she should do next. Her feelings for Lucas were not only intense but also frightening. She understood that loving her own brother was something that society would not accept, and the realization of this tore her apart all the time. However, after all that she had been through, she realized that she could no longer ignore what was going on in her heart. It wasn't just a stage in her life, it was her essence. Her love for Lucas was a part of her. Time could not erase it. A new relationship did not help to distract, and running away only increased this craving. After the breakup with Michael, and especially after that meeting with Lucas at the family holiday, Aya increasingly thought that she needed to talk to her brother. She couldn't run away from reality anymore. Her love for Lucas was too strong, and now she needed to do something about it. But what? How could she admit such feelings to a man who was so close to her, but whom she was afraid of losing at the same time? Every time Aya started thinking about confessing her feelings to Lucas, she was terrified. She didn't know how he would react. Perhaps he will reject her, finding her confession disgusting and unacceptable. What if he just stopped talking to her? This fear tore her apart, but she could no longer remain in a state of uncertainty. Her heart screamed that she had to do something, that further attempts to suppress her feelings would lead her to self-destruction. Aya decided that she needed to meet Lucas to finally talk to him openly. The internal conflict was bothering her. She knew it was a risk, that talking could ruin everything, but she needed to find out the truth. No matter how painful it was for her, Aya realized that only frankness could free her from this painful burden. She could no longer live in a state of perpetual fear and uncertainty. It had been several weeks since the night she decided to end her relationship with Michael, and during that time Aya had been trying to collect her thoughts. Her inner world was in complete turmoil. On the one hand, she understood that her feelings for Lucas could destroy their relationship, but on the other hand, she could no longer live in a state of perpetual pretense. She had to tell him the truth, even if it would be painful for both her and him. One evening, Aya decided to write to Lucas. She thought about every word for a long time, her hands trembling as she typed the message. In the end, she sent a short message asking to meet, without further explanation, just indicating that they needed to talk. She was afraid that he might not answer, but to her surprise, the answer came quickly. Lucas agreed to meet her at the very cafe where they usually met before. On the day they were supposed to meet, Aya felt like she had a huge burden on her shoulders. She knew that this conversation could change everything. Her fear of the possible consequences was huge, but inside she had the determination to finally admit her feelings. When she entered the cafe, she saw Lucas sitting at their usual table. He looked like he had been waiting for her all his life. His gaze was full of concern and anxiety, but at the same time he seemed to feel that this conversation would be important for both of them. Aya sat down opposite him, feeling her insides tighten with tension. This whole year of fighting with herself had brought her to this moment. Her heart was beating so fast that she could barely breathe. Her fingers were trembling, and she was afraid to look up at her brother, because she knew that his gaze could break her resolve. But she gathered all her willpower into a fist and began to speak. She told him everything, starting from the moment she began to realize that her feelings for him had changed. Aya frankly confessed how long she had been trying to fight this love, how she had run away, hoping that the distance would help her cope with it. She talked about Michael, about how she tried to build a relationship with him to forget about Lucas, but realized that no other man could replace him in her heart. Her voice trembled as she talked about how much she was tormented by this love that she couldn't control. Lucas listened to her attentively, without interrupting. He saw how hard it was for her to say those words, and his own heart ached from the pain she was going through. Her frankness broke the invisible barrier that had existed between them all this year. He felt that they were both suffering because of this forbidden love, and the realization that their feelings were mutual startled him. At the same time, this realization was both a relief and a curse. After a long pause, in which each of them digested what they had heard, Lucas also confessed his feelings to Aya. He told her about how he was painfully trying to cope with the same pain as she was. His heart was torn apart every time he tried to forget her, but he knew it was impossible. Meeting on a family holiday only increased his torment, but he did not dare to take a step forward, for fear of destroying what remained between them. When they both admitted their feelings, the silence that hung in the air was almost palpable. It was the moment of truth, when all the masks were ripped off and their hearts were exposed. They both understood that what they felt for each other could not be accepted by society. This love wasn't just a contradiction, it was a taboo that both of them couldn't ignore. But despite all these prohibitions, they could no longer deny their feelings. Aya and Lucas realized that their future was now hanging in the balance. They knew that if they decided to be together, they would have to face enormous difficulties. Their love will never be approved by family, friends, or society. They will have to live in secret, hiding their feelings from anyone who might condemn them. It was a huge risk, but they both understood that they could no longer live pretending that all this did not exist. They sat together in this cafe for a long time, silently, thinking about everything that had happened. Their hearts were full of contradictions. On the one hand, it was love that they could not resist, and on the other, the understanding that this love could destroy their lives. But now that they had confessed to each other, they had no choice. They had to decide how to live their lives, and it was not an easy decision. Aya felt that she was no longer alone in her struggle. This year had been full of pain, but now she knew that her feelings weren't one-sided. It gave her strength, but at the same time she understood that their path would be extremely difficult. There were many obstacles ahead of them, but now they were ready to accept this challenge. Aya and Lucas knew that their love would never be simple, but they decided to give it a chance. They did not know what would happen next. They did not know if they would be able to cope with the difficulties that awaited them. But they were determined to try. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was their only option. Aya and Lucas could no longer live in a state of constant suppression of their feelings. Now they were in this fight together, and whatever lay ahead, they were ready to go through it together. At parting, they exchanged glances full of understanding and love. There was everything in that look: fear of the unknown, relief that they were no longer alone in their suffering, and determination to move on, no matter what. It was a moment that changed their lives forever. Aya and Lucas did not know what path they had to go through, but they knew one thing: now they would walk it together, regardless of what society, family, or even their own inner fears said. Their love was too strong to be ignored. And now they were ready to give her a chance, no matter how hard the choice was.